Good morning, everyone. I will say this is the first time I've done a presentation where there has been popcorn and makings for ice cream sundaes or root beer floats and birthday songs. There's a reason I love this church so much, and it's so good to be back here today. So thank you. So we go from celebrating birthdays to talking about death. We're going to get the whole life spectrum here. Before we formally begin, if you don't have a folder yet, there are some folders on the back table. And on the left-hand side of the folder is something that just explains a little about what this is. So I am working on my doctoral degree right now, a doctorate of ministry, and part of that is doing a project. And as a hospice chaplain and a hospital chaplain, I began to learn a lot about medical aid in dying, but I also began to see how little we actually know about it, or what we think we know about it, we're thinking is something else. And so I decided to do a project designed at equipping congregations on how to open our hearts to people who are impacted by medical aid in dying, how we can provide care to those people. Or we may all be in that end of life place someday ourselves. Actually, we know we will be. So also learning information for ourselves. As part of the formal dissertation process, there's a letter at the front just explaining that this project has been deemed ethical by an international review board. It just goes through some of the formal language. And then there's an evaluation, which you're not required to fill out at all. But if you're willing to, it really helps me know how to make this as effective as possible. There's also a consent form to sign and then an optional demographic form. I've noticed in my other presentations that for very valid reasons, there's a lot of questions that come up, especially when we're talking about something around dying, because we don't always do that well in this country. I will ask that you just hold your questions until the end so we can get through the presentation. Then there will be a brief pause for the evaluation, and then I'll have time for questions and answers, and I'm happy to hang out and answer to the best of my ability. And I can tell you when I don't have the answer, I can usually find it and get it to you. So if there's something I can't answer today, feel free to give me your contact information and I'll get that for you. We'll go over to the next slide. So why are we here? We are here to discuss medical aid in dying, so we can better understand with clarity and compassion and even theological reflection what it is. I really want to help reduce stigma and shame that sometimes comes up for people when they're discussing it or considering it in their lives. And I want to support compassionate conversation. So we will very briefly talk about what it is and what it is not, kind of the ethical framework that it lives within, and also as a Christian community, primarily here, we're going to talk about it from a theological lens as well, and then how we can provide support. So it's really important that we first define a few terms. What I have seen in my reading about MAID and my conversations about MAID is that sometimes people have really strong reactions, and what they're reacting to is often a very different picture than what MAID actually is. So we're going to talk briefly about these three things: suicide, euthanasia, and medical aid in dying. One helpful way to think about the differences between them are these questions: who's acting? What is the context? And what is the intent? So in MAID, A person who is already dying, so they have typically a prognosis of 6 months or less, chooses to take a medication that has been legally prescribed to them. So there's some key words here: terminal illness. There's also decision-making capacity and self-administration. And I'll get into all of that a little bit more later. Euthanasia, which it's often confused with, is different because someone else is administering the medication. This is not legal in the United States. And finally, suicide. Suicide occurs outside often the context of a terminal illness, and it's often in isolation. It's a difficult thing to talk about, and there are so many traditions that equate suicide and medical aid in dying because it is the intentionality of ending one's life. But as we'll see in MAID, there's very legal parameters that it lives within, and I think the big piece is that MAID keeps somebody from having to be isolated at the time of death. It provides support that is often missing for people. I really want us to hold on to that when we are talking about MAID, we're not talking about suicide and euthanasia. We're not talking about these things interchangeably. In everyday conversation, the reality is that these three often get blurred together. And that really can shape how somebody feels before they actually even know what it is. Now, of course, we've been talking about death and dying through all of history. I can think about things that Socrates was writing about it. I mean, this is an ancient conversation. I'm not going to go into the whole history of death and dying. But I'll go to the next slide. Conversations about end-of-life decision-making, although they've been part of our lives forever, MAID came in a little more recently in New Mexico. So the law here did not begin as some abstract policy debate. It began in the lived experience of someone who was facing the end of her life, Judge Elizabeth Whitefield. She was an extraordinary woman who was living with cancer, and it was taking away all of her moments of joy from life, the ability to eat and drink, to do the things that once really brought a lot of meaning to her life. So she wanted medical aid in dying to become legal in New Mexico. She said, "Cancer has stolen everything from me. My ability to work, my ability to eat, my ability to drink. Don't let me die without dignity." Ultimately, the bill did not pass, and she ended up dying before MAID ever became legal in New Mexico. There were, however, an extraordinary group of advocates who renewed the effort of the bill in 2019, and they renamed it in her honor. So now we've got this long name, the Elizabeth Whitefield End of Life Options Act. It's a big topic with a lot of feelings around it. It still failed 2 more times. It finally became law in 2021. In New Mexico, as in other places, this lives within very specific legal safeguards and eligibility. So the safeguards begin with who is eligible. You have to be 18 years old or older. You have to have full decisional capacity, so no one can make this decision for you. It has to be a terminal diagnosis confirmed by 2 providers. The written request must be witnessed and signed by 2 people. It's important to note, again, this is 100% voluntary, and if someone decides to use medical aid in dying, they can change their mind up until the very moment they self-administer that medication. And the big thing that I mentioned earlier is you must have the ability to self-administer. So that's either orally or via rectal administration. So that's a very, very brief overview of the legal parameters. Basically, what happens is the patient will make the request. The evaluation is completed to determine eligibility, and if they meet all criteria, then the prescription is written. What happens then is the patient has time to talk with their family members, with their loved ones, about the timing of it. Who do they want present? What do they want the setting of their death to look like? Do they have particular music they want to be listening to? Is there readings they want to hear? Would they like to have someone come and offer prayer before they self-administer the medication? Would they like somebody there to support their loved ones at that moment? So it provides time for these conversations. I say that you can pick the location. There are some limitations to that because there are several places where they will not allow MAID on their premises. So at that time, we start having conversations about, is there a volunteer who would be willing to open their home to this person? Is there a family member or a friend? Generally, I like to say that people can pick the location that they'll die in. And then we get to the actual day of. So this is a time where the one who is about to self-administer the medication gets to spend time in their chosen environment with their chosen people. Ideally, there's support for family and friends on hand. Once the patient self-administers the medication, typically they fall asleep into a very deep sleep within 3 to 10 minutes. The breathing gradually slows until the time of death. The mortuary is called, and when the death certificate is written, MAID is not the reason for death. It is the terminal illness that is written as the cause of death. So I like to think about having support for people at this time. One big support umbrella is hospice. And I know a lot of you here, and you know that I've been a chaplain for many years, so I am a big hospice person. Very briefly, a few words about hospice. Hospice is a Medicare benefit for anybody with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. I love it because it is very holistic support. So hospice pays attention to body, mind, and spirit. And it is focused, the whole team is focused on alleviating the suffering that is not just physical. We heard it in the sermon this morning, not just physical, it is also emotional. It can be spiritual. It gets a little tricky talking about hospice's connections to MAID because different hospices, I have learned, handle it differently. So hospice involvement with MAID varies, in part because hospice is federally funded, but MAID is not federally recognized. So it's legal in different states, but not all over the whole country. If someone you know or yourself wants hospice, you can ask the question, is this something how do you handle MAID within your organization? So you have the right to make these decisions, and they need to be honest and upfront with you. Then we get to the even bigger picture. So what happens in hospice and end-of-life care does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by a much larger and very complicated ethical and healthcare context. As I began to engage in this topic around medical aid in dying, it became clear to me that a lot of the tensions that are out there don't really begin with MAID itself. Instead, what MAID does is it brings into view the complexity of a healthcare system where people have long been navigating suffering, limited options, and difficult decisions. So we as a people, when we're talking to one another, when we're talking to those facing the end of life, need to realize they've been swimming in this for a really long time before these conversations began. We can look at the very high cost of healthcare. And that's even if you have insurance, forget if you don't have insurance. We can look at inequities in the healthcare system. Racism and sexism and lack of access to healthcare impact people long before they're even looking at the end of life. And even before we're talking about healthcare decisions, there is the very inequitable access to basic necessities in this country. So when I was working at UNMH during COVID, I just noticed that we had a really high proportion of Navajo patients. And I wondered why this was, so I did some digging, and I found this quote. Now I can't remember where it's from. I think ABC News, it's in my bibliography. 30% of the Navajo Nation residents do not have access to running water almost 200 years after its invention. It makes critical public health measures such as hand washing difficult to implement. That stood out to me because if we're not even giving people access to basic necessities in this country, then what are they going to be facing when they're at the end of their life? So this historical moment illustrates a much wider truth. Structural inequalities shape who suffers, who receives care, and whose lives are protected. MAID did not create these challenges, but it does bring them into sharper focus. So when we talk about MAID ethically, we're not just looking at simple right and wrong. We're looking at this tension between very deeply held values. So autonomy, the basic idea that the individual should have right to make decisions about their own body. We certainly see this at the start of life. So those choices of autonomy carry all the way through. People should have control over their own death and what that dying process looks like, ideally. And then, of course, we also have the responsibility and limit side. Medicine is shaped by the oath that we've all heard of do no harm. So there are many out there who say, wait, if I'm going to provide a medication for you that's going to end your life, I'm kind of doing harm. And then you've got others saying, yes, but if you are condemning me to suffering a long, terrible death, you're actually causing me greater harm. Another thing that I often heard in the research was this idea of a slippery slope. If we open the doors to medical aid in dying, then what's next? There's a lot of concern from different groups that MAID could be used to coerce them into ending their lives prematurely. These are the ethical questions, and so the question for us becomes, how do these show up in real life? So we talk about safeguards. We want to make sure that we're protecting vulnerable populations. We touch very briefly on inequity, who has access to healthcare and who doesn't, including MAID. And then there's this idea of suffering. How does suffering get defined? Who gets to define that for a person? There's one woman named Megan Schrader, who is a very big name in the disabled activist community. And she is deeply concerned that MAID would be used as an eradication tool against the disabled community. She said, "The disabled community is reaping the consequences of a society that is so apathetic towards disabled people's basic needs that it can't be bothered to provide us with suicide prevention. We are dirt." Her story gives voice to the concern that protecting autonomy cannot come at the expense of protecting the vulnerable populations. Her concern is rooted in a much broader reality that the disabled community, like many communities, have long experienced gaps in basic necessities, in access, and in healthcare. And it also shows, if we think back to the earlier slide, how MAID is often understood alongside suicide, which further complicates how people feel about it. Then there's a story of a young man named Adam Meyer Clayton in Canada. He was living with and tried multiple ways over multiple years to treat his chronic and debilitating pain, which was brought on by a work-related accident. Nothing brought relief, which understandably then led to emotional suffering, mental suffering, spiritual suffering. He tried everything. He then tried to access medical aid in time, but because his was not a terminal diagnosis, remember that's one of the legal safeguards, he was denied MAID. He said at that moment, "If someone has been suffering for years and years, like myself, then what are you protecting them from? You're not protecting them, you are confirming them to pain." He later died by suicide. His father wrote in his obituary, "Our loving son Adam died of rational suicide after suffering from a neurobiological illness with no cure." Adam's story raises questions about justice and inequity. When access is limited, people may feel like their suffering is being dismissed rather than addressed. For him and for others like him, it feels like a restriction of autonomy, which then leads to greater harm later on. Stories like Adam's and Megan's highlight the access and systemic limitations that MAID lives within and how care or lack thereof shape decisions at the end of life. They highlight questions of vulnerability and protection and how we interpret suffering and agency. At the center of all of this is suffering. What do we mean by suffering? We go back to the sermon again. So, putting suffering at the end of life also into a bigger picture. Technological advances in medicine have done a lot of great things. They also have prolonged life. So we can think of, you've been on like an ICU in the hospital, you've got people who are intubated, they're on multiple pressors, all these machines keeping their body alive. And I have one colleague who I worked with years ago at UNMH. He was also a chaplain, and he would say to families, there is a point that all of these machines are giving your loved one the hope for life continuing. But at a certain point in time, these machines are just preventing death from happening. So medical technology has also made this conversation even of what is dying. How do we know when we're dying? There's a story that Dr. Atal Gawande wrote in one of his books about a young woman named Sarah Monopoly. She was pregnant with her first and only child, was so excited to be a mother, and then found out that she had very advanced cancer. So she had to face these really terrible decisions at what should have been a really joyful time of her life. They decided to pursue aggressive treatments, and these treatments, with a lot of help, gave her the chance to be a mother. So she had a beautiful baby girl. And then, of course, she wanted to be there for this beautiful baby girl. But the treatments got harder and harder and harder on her body. And I can't even begin to imagine the cost of cancer treatments at the end of life, even with insurance. So what happened is these treatments started hurting her. But the world around her was saying, keep fighting, keep fighting. So she kept going and going with treatments. Her and her husband and family refused hospice care or palliative care. One night there was a crisis at home and her husband had nobody to call. So he called 911, and ultimately she died in the hospital, which was something she had explicitly said she did not want. Stories like her raise questions about how we think of suffering and care. The same treatments that gave her meaningful time also contributed to her suffering. But then we can look back at Adam, right? Just a minute ago. His suffering wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was spiritual. It was mental. The hard part is that none of us can define for one another what a tolerable level of suffering is. Sarah and her family made the best decision they could about the level of suffering that she could tolerate. But it's still swimming in this bigger ethical picture. Now, for us as a community, suffering is not just experienced in ourselves, but also in community. So we'll go to this. How do we situate this within the middle of our faith? Now, there's a lot of good Presbyterians in here. And Presbyterians often say God alone is the Lord of the conscience, meaning basically that individuals are called to wrestle faithfully with complex decisions. The PCUSA does not have an official stance on medical aid in dying. Rather, they focus on us being a connectional community. So we're called to care for one another, even maybe especially in the face of suffering. And we also, as Presbyterians, say we can find meaning in suffering. Perhaps we can learn more about ourselves and our loved ones in the process of suffering. And we talk about Christ who suffered. Really and truly, faithful Christians everywhere hold very different perspectives on how they handle this idea of suffering, end of life, and medical aid in dying. There are some denominations that are flat out say, no, it's not allowed. Catholic, Methodist, I'm not sure about the Methodist. That's what it said in my reading, that I need to find a Methodist pastor to ask. And then the Southern Baptists have come out very strongly against medical aid in dying. For the most part, they all say, it's between you and God and your community and your family. A couple of places say we fully support it, and that's United Church of Christ and Universalist Unitarians. For the most part, all of these groups, faithful people all over the world, are looking at autonomy and ways to relieve suffering. So there's really not a single religious stance. Because there's not a single binding stance, that means that we have a lot of things to wrestle with in our life. Sometimes it would be nice if there was a set rule book, but there's really not. But there are some people who have looked at how we handle difficult life circumstances and situations. One of my favorites is Walter Brueggemann. He wrote a beautiful short little book called Praying the Psalms. And he breaks life kind of broadly into 3 categories: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. Over to you. So orientation, generally there's a sense of routine and stability. Life makes sense. This does not mean when you're in an orientation state that life is at all easy. But when things come up, you can generally handle the disruptions. It's really the world that we kind of all expect to live in, even though we don't always live in it. It's just what we hope for. It's what we've gotten used to. But what happens when there's moments where you can't just easily get over something? Then we enter the state of disorientation. This is a time when life feels completely out of control. There's a lot of uncertainty and isolation. And this often occurs when folks are facing end-of-life decisions. So they've just learned that their diagnosis is terminal. So there's not a cure for what they're going through. That is one big place for disorientation. So when we are looking at people in our lives that we love who are facing these end-of-life matters, we can be compassionate and remember that they are not in an oriented state right now. Everything is moving rapidly and upside down. Brueggemann turns to the Psalms as a place of support during disorientation. He says that the work of prayer is to fully explore and exploit metaphor in terms of our own experience. I will often talk with patients and families for whom the Psalms is an important text about the Psalms of Lament, because we forget lament is part of our holy experience. Just a few lines from one of the Psalms of Lament. O Lord God of my salvation, at night when I cry out before you, let my prayer come to you. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eyes have grown dim through sorrow. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. My companions are in darkness. So we hear in this holy text somebody who is right in the middle of disorientation. The metaphor of being in the pit, of feeling isolated, where the friends and neighbors are shunning you. It's a place of shame. In disorientation, this is what it feels like to lose control and stability. But I want to share with you briefly the story of how one family navigated a place of disorientation. The story of a woman named Frances and her husband, Tim. She was a former critical care RN who got it. She'd been with a lot of people facing end of life. She was living with ALS. ALS took away the vocation that she loved, and over time, it took away her ability to speak and to move easily. She had the support of hospice in place, and she and her husband talked about it, and she said, I don't want to keep suffering like this. I'm losing all of my joy. I'm losing the ability to engage in anything that brought me meaning. So she decided to use medical aid in dying. Her spouse was initially very supportive of her, but then she said, I don't want our kids here. And this became a very tense family moment for them, navigating who would be there at the end of her life. And he rightly said, look, our kids may need this for themselves, and I need them nearby at least. So they navigated very difficult conversations with the help of their hospice team. And it ultimately was decided that on the day when she ingested the medication, she would have her hospice team, her spouse, children, and her two very best friends. I put that into a very small container, but you can imagine the conversations that they must have been having in their household. But for this family, reorientation came through them working through it together with the support of hospice. She had her friends and family there the day that she died, and when she died, her family and friends had one another to hold in the midst of their grief. The author who interviewed them for her book wrote, "Scripting death through MAID can restore a sense of order and control to what otherwise might be seen as the ultimate uncontrollable experience." And this is what Walter Brueggemann calls reorientation. What we see in the story of Frances is not a return to what was, but rather, through that event, the emergence of connection and meaning and support in the middle of loss. I need to say that reorientation does not mean easy. Frances had ALS. She lost a lot of things before she died. Her family still lost their mother, wife, best friend. The grief was still real, but they were able to know that they had supported her in this decision and that she died with dignity and surrounded by love, and they had one another and that support. Just 3 Psalms after Psalm 88 comes Psalm 91, which reminds us as well of God's presence in the midst of it all. God will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. Frances and her family were supported by hospice and friends, even at the moment of death. So maybe there's a clue in there for all of us here. Community, all of us, becomes the way we experience and can provide refuge and love. There's a wonderful theologian named Frederick Buechner. Some of you may have heard me quote him before. He says, "The place God calls you to is where your deep joy meets someone's deep need." And then there's this brilliant doctor, in speaking about the end of life, who said, here are the needs that exist at the end of life. The need to give and receive love, to be understood, to be valued as a human being, to explore beliefs and values, to express feelings honestly, the need to find meaning and purpose in life. So then we go to what we can do to answer those needs. We can love. We can provide compassionate listening for those who have been swimming in difficult realities. We can provide space for honest reflection without jumping down somebody's throat. We can offer spiritual connection, a faith community, but also a relational connection, and how we're there for one another. In naming these needs, it also invites us to consider how often these needs have gone unmet before someone ever considers MAID. One of the big ways is through isolation. So there was a family member who opted to use medical aid in dying. Some of the family was supportive, others not so much. One of the supportive family members was reflecting about it later and said this: they were horrified. They didn't even want to talk about it. Both my sister-in-law and my brother have actually not told their community that the patient chose MAID because they're so embarrassed and upset by it. In this instant, it meant that the person facing end-of-life choices could not speak openly with them. That door was shut. But it also meant that this sister-in-law and brother had no one to talk to because of their own sense of shame around the event. The stigma exists, in part because people do not understand MAID or because they still equate it with suicide. This also then leads to silence. And silence can be really, really loud, y'all. Mm-hmm. Silence lets us know that there may be a lot of judgment present. So in the moment when people are most needing support, people find themselves often navigating it alone because they're afraid of being stigmatized or silenced. But that also includes caregivers who are just exhausted by this time. So I know some of you in this room may have been caregivers or are caregivers or have had caregivers. It can be exhausting to be a caregiver. Physically, emotionally, and spiritually, it is a sense of constant responsibility on your shoulders. In my work as a hospice chaplain, I am continuously worried often more about the family than I am about the patient because of the weight of the world being on their shoulders. And then there's still this moral tension, right? Because of the stigma and the silence and the shame. So caregivers at this time are swimming in it. One woman said, "My life became really unbalanced towards the end. I didn't even really think about, hey, what do I need for myself?" In these stages, we often begin to also see how grief is already present for the person who is dying, but also for the people caring for them as they live through the slow losses of decline. So grief comes long before death. We call it anticipatory grief. But grief also comes for numerous reasons in life: loss of relationship, loss of future dreams, right? This person who's dying is thinking, oh, I'm not going to get to do X, Y, and Z. I may not get to see this loved one graduate or marry. It's painful. And it's also the loss of people we love after they die. It's important to note that grief is normal. It also becomes very complicated because, once again, there's not a right or wrong way to grieve. So talking about this, I'm not talking about erasing grief, but there is a time where grief becomes more complicated. Now, research has found that grief after MAID really isn't a whole lot different than grief after any other death, except when there is stigma, shame, silence, isolation, then the grief becomes a lot more complicated. It also becomes complicated. We think about those caregivers mentioned, the ones who were ashamed of their loved one's decision. there's a good chance that their grief was also more complicated because they had a hard time finding space to articulate everything that they were holding inside. So when we as a community talk about supporting people through and after a MAID-related loss, we're not talking about taking away grief. Not even God can take away grief. It's a part of the human experience. What we are talking about is how as we as a people, a community, can help their grief from becoming more complicated because of silence, isolation, or stigma. So very briefly, how do we do that? So it sounds really hokey, but presence is deeply important, especially when we think about the fact that so many people have felt isolated or have been carrying very heavy burdens for a long time. A lot of times I hear people say, oh, I don't know what to say to them. I don't know, I'm gonna say the wrong thing, I'm gonna hurt them. So they don't make the phone call. They don't do the visit because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. That only intensifies this isolation in a time where you should be spending moments with the people you love and that you care about. So presence really matters. It provides comfort, it reduces the stress, and it eases the loneliness. To the best of my knowledge, I have not entered a dying state quite yet, but I can imagine how lonely that space can feel. And I have faced the dying and the death of many people I love, and it can be so lonely. So just showing up matters. For communities of faith, you're actually doing a big part of it right now just by being here. Staying informed about what in the world this medical aid and dying thing is. In my early research, a few things that caught me were when people would say, you know, I went to my church, I went to my pastor, I went to my grief group, but I felt like I had to provide education about medical aid and dying before I could receive care. So I don't want folks to have to be teaching when they're grieving. So just by being here, I think you've already done a huge step. I said earlier about presence. I think refusing abandonment, no matter how we feel, I'm not here to convince you that MAID is okay or not okay. What I am here to say is we see the system that people have been swimming in by the time they hit end of life. They need support and we need support too. So refusing abandonment. And then creating space for dialogue, including the people who might disagree with their loved one's decision. Can you have a quiet conversation with them so they can just get it off their chest and feel like at least they were heard? Something that did not make it onto this slide, but I've also begun to be curious about what rituals might look like, what we could do as a people of faith for those who have decided to use medical aid in dying. Is there a service that they might want ahead of time, a particular reading that they want to hear, or a shared communal experience? As this church congregation, you all know yourselves pretty well. So even saying, hey, let's talk about what we could do if somebody in our church decides to use medical aid in dying. Is there a way to create this space around them that honors them? At the end of the day, this presentation, this dissertation, this conversation isn't really just about policy or even individual decisions. It's really about us, right? It's about people who are navigating suffering, loss, and very complicated choices. And while we cannot change every circumstance, we can change that nobody will have to face this alone again. So as we move forward, I'm going to give you a few minutes. For those who kind of came in after I gave my first little spiel, in the folder there's a consent form that would need to be signed if you're willing to do the evaluation. The evaluation is front and back. I learned to say that after my first presentation. And number 1 on the evaluation means that you strongly disagree with the statement. So 1, strongly disagree, 4, strongly agree. And it's okay to skip any of the questions, including the demographics. But if you're willing to do the evaluation, it just helps me to tighten this for future congregations. And after a moment, we'll come back and I'll see if anybody has questions.